gate entrance.
Turret ready to deploy.
There are two types of people who buy Call of Duty. On one side, there's the fans who've played many, if not every game, and recognise the differences between each title regardless of how subtle. These people generally have strong feelings about which game is the best, and are likely to sink hundreds of hours into the various modes. Then you have the people at the opposite end of the spectrum. They might have played one or two of the previous games, or they may not have played any. These are the people who jump on occasionally to play a couple of matches, but aren't likely to prestige or dig deep into the game's meta. I bring this up because I think it's an important distinction to make when reviewing 2019's Modern Warfare, because the type of player you are will greatly affect the lens through which you view it. Call of Duty Modern Warfare has been heralded by many as the most refreshing and original game in the series in a long time. This is certainly how the marketing has positioned it, and it's a message that appears to have influenced many people's opinion. I made a video a little while back on just how successful the marketing has been at convincing everybody that 2019's Call of Duty is unlike any game before it. By the way, you should totally check that video out for context. The problem is though, unless you're a seasoned COD fan, you might struggle to see the differences between this game and the previous ones. You see, 2019's Modern Warfare doesn't dramatically reinvent what Call of Duty is. Instead of innovating through obvious changes like new movement mechanics, destructible environments, or futuristic settings, this year's game revisits a classic setting to focus on what made Call of Duty a household name in the first place. For the most part, I think it succeeded. Modern Warfare is an excellent and important game in the franchise, but it would be easy to mistake it as a simple cash grab that piggybacks off the success of the original Modern Warfare trilogy. And while this definitely was a part of the marketing strategy, it's clear that the development team have gone well beyond simply updating the visuals of a 10-year-old game.
Be advised, friendly precision airstrike inbound. UAV standing by.
So Modern Warfare, much like World War II, uses a combination of nostalgia and a back-to-basics approach with its gameplay as a central hook. Unlike World War II though, which was really just a modern-day interpretation of the earlier games in the series, Modern Warfare has been pitched as more realistic, tactical, and mature. While I'd agree this is true for the single-player campaign and also the co-op, the multiplayer is every bit as fast and unforgiving as any of the previous titles. That doesn't mean it's a copy and paste job though. There are numerous changes to the underlying systems and mechanics that have a very meaningful impact on the overall experience, but they don't fundamentally change the formula. From a purely moment-to-moment action point of view, this is very much a Call of Duty game, and if you haven't enjoyed the multiplayer in previous CODs, then you may not love what's on offer here. The biggest difference between this game and the 11 games that preceded it is that it's the first to really look at what made the original so good. In a way, it feels like a spiritual successor, or the sequel we never got. Modern Warfare 2 and every game that followed it chose to up the ante, adding bigger set-piece moments and more chaos to the gameplay. 2019's Call of Duty has instead decided to roll the clock back and revisit both a setting and a style of gameplay that we haven't really seen in the franchise since 2007. Returning to familiar territory and revisiting many of the weapons and kill streaks that longtime players know so well has allowed the development team to really showcase how much more they've been able to do with the current tech. Now, 2016's Modern Warfare Remastered gave us a glimpse at what a modern interpretation of the original game might be like by upping the visual and audio fidelity. But from a game design point of view, most of it was identical to the source material, and visuals aren't the only thing that's improved in the last 10 years. With this year's game, everything has been reconsidered, with the view of making it feel more believable, and this includes looking at all the little details as well as the big ones. Weapon animations, for example, look far more realistic, with small touches like smoke appearing from the end of the barrel after prolonged fire. The grenade toss is another example. Clearly someone took the time to observe how Tier 1 operators actually throw them, and it looks way more convincing than the robotic throws that we're used to. These sorts of changes might seem unimportant, but they all add up, giving the entire experience a very considered and polished feel. The audio design is one of the clear standouts in the presentation. Infinity Ward went to great lengths to make it the most realistic and dynamic in the series so far. They recorded real weapons using something like 90 microphones in different scenarios to get the most authentic representation possible. The result is gun noises that react differently depending on how and where you fire them. So if you fire a handgun in a confined space like a corridor, it will sound very different to firing it out in the open. This isn't limited to your own weapons either. Gun noise from enemy players receive the same treatment with added reverb and a realistic distance-based delay. In addition to simply sounding awesome, it makes it possible to determine an enemy's location and surroundings by what the weapon sounds like. Learning to track down enemies using sound is really important too. Playing with a headset has always provided an advantage, but now I'd say that playing without one puts you at a significant disadvantage. The audio design has its own little details too, like the noise that shell casings make when they fall on different surfaces. Again, all of this attention to detail might be lost on those who haven't played much Call of Duty before, but when you start to notice these little touches, it really elevates the entire presentation. Okay, so yeah, if it wasn't really obvious, I think very highly of this game. The present day setting, reality-based combat, and the no-nonsense movement system are all things that I love when done well in Call of Duty. That being said, there are still plenty of frustrating elements, and unfortunately I think they stand out even more because the rest of the game is so polished. Also, if you're a big fan of the art direction and game design of some of the more recent titles like the Black Ops games, then Modern Warfare's muted presentation might feel really bland to you. Modern Warfare offers 3 different modes, with the single-player campaign, competitive multiplayer, and co-op. For the first time since probably Modern Warfare 3, everything feels like a cohesive package, unlike in the past games where the Zombies mode felt like its own separate thing. Although it technically has the same number of game modes as something like Black Ops 4 or World War II, it definitely feels like there's less to do than in the previous entries, especially if multiplayer isn't your thing. The campaign, for instance, is short, even by Call of Duty standards, and although it's the most visually impressive so far, the first half of it isn't very interesting. The problem is that most of the characters are forgettable stereotypes, and the dialogue in a lot of scenes pretty much boils down to, "Oh yeah, I'm a total badass. Are you ready to kick some ass and save the world? Alright." I almost gave up at the halfway point, which would have been a mistake because the story does pick up in the second half. There are some well-designed missions, but the order of them just seems all wrong. You have to wait until almost the end of the campaign before you get some important character building and exposition that should have really been at the beginning. Also, the heavily scripted and linear format that the series has clung to for well over a decade is really starting to feel outdated. Like, there's this mission where you're attacking a military base and you're on the front lines trying to take out enemy infantry, but your squad keeps yelling at you to pilot these little remote-controlled planes carrying explosives to take out helicopters. I mean, it just makes no sense that while in the middle of a gunfight with troops swarming around you, that you'd be able to safely stop and do something like that. Now, there is a realism setting which removes the HUD and makes it feel less video gamey, but I think unless you play through it this way first, a lot of the suspense will be lost because each mission plays out almost exactly the same way each time. All up, while the campaign is one of the better efforts we've seen in a while, I wouldn't say that it's worth the price of admission on its own. It's very short and there isn't much reason to play through it again. You can try for a better threat assessment score by shooting less innocent people, and this rewards you with stuff like skins for the multiplayer, but apart from that, once you've played through it once, you've seen everything. One of the biggest changes between this game and many of the previous ones is the lack of a zombies mode. Okay, so technically Ghosts had aliens, not zombies, but it was essentially the same thing. You have to go all the way back to 2011's Modern Warfare 3 to find a game that doesn't have some kind of spin on this mode. The reason it's been left out this year is because it was felt that it didn't fit in with the game's reality-based theme, which makes sense. While Zombies in the other games has basically branched off into a standalone thing, having little or nothing to do with the campaign or multiplayer, co-op is a blend of the two, adding new missions for squads of up to 4 players. It does play a little bit like Zombies in the sense that you have to complete objectives, but the maps here are way larger. It's pretty hard too, you really have to work together to keep pushing forward. I'm not normally a PvE kind of guy, but this is much more fun than I expected. PS4 owners also get the Spec Ops Survival mode, which has drawn a lot of criticism for being a timed exclusive. It's definitely shitty when this sort of thing happens, particularly when it contradicts the efforts of the developers to bring the player base together with things like crossplay. Non-consumer friendly practices aside though, Xbox and PC players aren't really missing out on much here. It's a wave-based mode that can be fun to play for a couple of rounds, but beyond that I can't really see people returning to this over and over again. Look, it's challenging and all, but when compared to just about everything else, it's kind of basic.
Target spotted.
For most people though, the meat of the Call of Duty experience is the multiplayer, and since the original Modern Warfare it's been growing in size and features. Unlike previous installments though, 2019's COD mostly throws out the notion that you need to continuously add new features to keep it feeling fresh. Instead, it retools existing systems in new and interesting ways. I say mostly because there definitely are some new ideas such as Ground War, which I'll get into shortly, but by and large the multiplayer is a throwback to the older games. Class loadouts, for instance, have long been a staple in the multiplayer, but the level of depth on offer here is unlike anything we've seen before. Take weapon customization for example. Modifying weapons is handled predominantly through the attachment system. This isn't a particularly new concept, except that here, attachments almost universally have trade-offs. You can have up to 5 attachments at any given time, and there aren't really any restrictions to which combinations you can have. Where it gets interesting though is that many of them have the same negative attributes, and if you stack too many with the same disadvantages together, you can actually make a weapon harder to use. Adding a scope for instance will give you a better view on a target, but you'll typically lose some aim down sights time. The stocks can improve weapon handling but come at the cost of stability, and barrel mods can reduce aim down sights times but will decrease bullet velocity. There is a ton of different attachments and combinations, which makes it possible to completely change both the appearance and characteristics of a weapon. This system provides a lot of variety too, allowing you to create setups for specific scenarios, or if you prefer, you can build in more versatility. If you want to turn your MP5 into a close-range powerhouse by sacrificing its long-range potential, you can. And conversely, you can set it up to be more of a jack-of-all-trades, but it won't excel in any one department. It's not the same for each weapon either. You can't force something like a P90 into a long-range role, nor can you make a close-range sniper rifle, thank God. But you can mitigate a weapon's weaknesses or buff its strengths. My only criticism is that some weapons are borderline unusable until you rank them up. The stock FAL, for instance, has very high visual recoil, making it difficult to land sequential shots. Once you unlock a foregrip and an optic, things start to get better, but I'm guessing that most players won't be bothered grinding out the early levels to unlock its potential. It remains to be seen how balanced the attachment system is, and undoubtedly it will need patching as time goes on because people will figure out the god tier setups before long. But for now at least, unlocking attachments and experimenting with different combinations is super addictive. Killstreaks on the other hand have seen the least amount of change, with many of them returning from previous games and operating in a similar way. They definitely look and sound better than ever before, but the lack of original ideas in this area is a little disappointing. With so many customization options for your loadout, it seems strange that the same level of freedom isn't possible here. Despite a large number of features that provide more tactical options like door peeking and being able to fire your sidearm when on ladders, remaining highly mobile is still the most advantageous way to play. In modes like Team Deathmatch and Domination, the gunplay seems to highly favour the run and gun approach. I personally like this because it feels like the Call of Duties of old, and it also fits in with how I like to play, but anyone hoping for more tactical play outside of the inherently tactical modes like Search and Destroy are probably going to be really disappointed. If you do like the traditional multiplayer formula though, then there's a lot to enjoy. The trademark progression system is just as addictive as ever, and now that all weapons attachments and equipment are earned through clear linear unlock paths, it never feels like you're sinking time into something that may never pay off. One area of the multiplayer that has some big issues is the map design, and although there are some good ones, there's also some real stinkers. Infinity Ward decided to ditch the 3-lane concept that's been common in heaps of the older games, and what they came up with here is very hit and miss. The maps that I think are the least successful are the large ones, and specifically Ania Palace. On top of it being difficult to find the action in these larger maps, there are just too many windows, buildings and other hidey holes for players to sit in. This makes matches move very slowly, and it massively increases the odds of getting shot in the back by some irritating bushwookie. I will say that most of the environments look more like real locations than the maps of old, which often just felt like paintball arenas. Whether or not this realism translates into fun gameplay is debatable, but visually at least the maps look good. Hopefully Infinity Ward can rectify things later on with some better designs, or even by editing the existing ones. At launch, there are a decent number of multiplayer modes. You've got series mainstays like Team Deathmatch and Domination, as well as some new ones like Cyber Attack and Gunfight. Most of what's here is good, and there's a nice mixture of slow and methodical as well as fast-paced game types. The outlier for me though is Ground War. I'm sure that some people will really love this larger game type, but for me, there really isn't anything it gets right. I think what I dislike about it the most is that it exaggerates everything that's frustrating about the smaller modes. Getting constantly destroyed by kill streaks, explosions, and players you couldn't see is unavoidable. The map isn't dynamic either, there's no destructible buildings, vegetation, or any other way of modifying the terrain. So unlike Battlefield, matches play out almost the same way each time, resulting in a giant shitstorm in and around the main buildings. There's also no sense of your team working together, at least not in any of the games that I played. This is the first time we've seen controllable tanks in the multiplayer since World at War, but unfortunately here they're really poorly executed. As with the design of the weapons, the developers claimed that a lot of time was spent making sure they felt both realistic and fun to operate. I can't say that I have much experience with real-life tanks, but I can tell you that these tanks suck. They manage to be both overpowered and too fragile at the same time, making them frustrating to deal with and equally frustrating to use. Compared to Battlefield's tanks, they feel like flimsy, cheap remote-controlled cars. The rest of the vehicles are fine, I guess, but none of them really stand out as particularly fun to use. They're really only there to help you get around quickly. It's clear that this mode was designed to directly compete with Battlefield, with similar features such as spawning in on squad members, ammo resupply stations, and also how it and the multiplayer have the same map overview that zooms in when you spawn. Overall though, Ground War doesn't feel very polished, and it lacks the necessary features that encourage coordinated team play. The fast time to kill feels even faster here, and dying from things you couldn't counter or didn't see coming feels overwhelming. If the intent was to compete with Battlefield, then I think it misses the mark. Even with all of Battlefield 5's problems, it still provides significantly superior large-scale battles and vehicular combat. A big win not only for this game but for the franchise and gaming in general is the removal of supply drops. Introduced in 2015 with Advanced Warfare, these have been included in every game since. Thankfully, there are no loot boxes in Modern Warfare, at least not at launch. Now, whether this changes long term remains to be seen. Activision put out a blog post that kind of addresses this, saying that they were introducing a battle pass system, not a loot box system, but it didn't explicitly say that loot boxes won't ever be in the game. I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens. As usual, the in-game economy hasn't been fully rolled out at launch, which is always concerning. It makes you wonder what they're trying to hide from the vast majority of reviews. Hopefully the paid system planned for this isn't as predatory as some of the previous games, but again, we'll just have to wait and see what happens down the line. Apart from the launch day server issues, Modern Warfare has mostly lived up to the typical solid technical performance the series is known for. Finding matches is quick and easy, and the connection during games seems to be better than it was during the beta, where there was quite a lot of lag. It also boots up nice and quick, just like the old games. I gotta say though, the day one patch is gigantic at 56 gigs, and if you want to play co-op, then there's an additional 15 gig download on top of that. So just bear in mind that combined with the game install, you've probably got at least an hour or more wait before you can jump online. Now this is for physical copies, so it could be slightly less painful for digital downloads. It kind of makes you wonder if there's anything on the disc at all though. To get back to my original point about the type of Call of Duty player you are and whether or not this Call of Duty is for you, let me give you an analogy. Call of Duty is like cake. There are lots of different types of cake and not everybody likes the same kind. Some people like sponge cake but can't stand mud. Some people like cream with their cake and others, like me, think it's disgusting. Some people don't like cake at all. These people are clearly crazy, but my point is that while cake can take on many forms, it's essentially the same thing at its core. Call of Duty has many flavors, but it's ultimately the same thing every year. Modern Warfare isn't a revolutionary experience, and if you don't like the previous games, then there's a pretty good chance you won't like this. If, however, you enjoyed the original Modern Warfare trilogy and will spend most of your time in the multiplayer, then Modern Warfare has a ton of depth and replay value, and I can't see why you shouldn't pick it up. Anyway, thanks for making it to the end of the video. If you want to let me know how you felt about my review with a like or a dislike, that would be awesome. If you've played the game, then I'd love to get your thoughts on it. Otherwise, cheers.